So, hello and welcome back, and welcome to Decorations. I am slowly but surely getting there. That is actually going to be the first craft of Vlogmas. I made it today, which was Thanksgiving Day for those of you in the States. I made it in stages in between cooking ham and mashed potatoes and yummy things like that. And it was really honestly it's super easy. I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I think it looks really cool. I wish it were that easy to make a real fireplace that you could actually have a fire in. But yeah, anyway, so be on the lookout if you're interested in making your own silly little fireplace. And the cool thing is, I I was gonna say it's pretty much free because everything in it except for the tea lights, the little battery operated tea lights, I had on hand. So very cool. Anyway, that's not what we're here for, though. We are here to finish a book, which is always such a bittersweet thing to do. Um, Hopefully, I have remembered to put up the community tab post on my community page uh, with a poll for our next book. I think we'll start it Sunday, so it's a really short poll. So if you have a vote, if you would like to vote on our next public domain book, please go to the community page and cast your vote, because whichever one has the most votes by Sunday will be the one that we start. Like I said, I'm going to take Saturday night off, probably put up this craft video, maybe, we'll see. It's gonna all depend on how fast I can edit it. Editing is my worst skill. I'm terrible at it, but maybe I'm getting a little bit better. It's really hard to say. Anyway, like I said, that is not why we are here, though. We are here to see how in the heck they pull this all off now that Jane is getting married to Bingley. Elizabeth has managed to convince her family that, yes, indeed, she is actually going to be married to Mr. Darcy. Jane didn't believe it. Her dad thought that she was just doing it to bring fortune to the family. And of course, Mrs. Bennet, she doesn't care. She just wants to be associated with the rich and powerful, and I don't think she cares how that comes about. I think of all the characters in the book, and this is including Bingley's sister and including Mrs. de Burgh, I honestly think Mrs. Bennet is possibly the least likable character in the book. And I think that's just because she just seems so wishy-washy. Like Bingley's sister, you know what she's about. You know that she is a mean girl. She's just your classic mean girl. Mrs. de Burgh is the classic aristocratic snob. But Mrs. Bennet, Jane and Elizabeth's mom, she is very wishy-washy and very just whatever will bring her the best standing. So I personally think she is the least likable character in the book. Although Mr. Collins is a very close second. He's kind of odious, which is a wonderful word. Anyway, enough of that. I've got so many thoughts spinning around in my head, and I guess I'm giving most of my thoughts in the intro. But we are going to finish Pride and Prejudice by the delightful Jane Austen with chapters 18 and 19 from volume 3. Elizabeth's spirits soon rising to playfulness again, she wanted Mr. Darcy to account for his ever falling in love with her. "How could you begin?" said she. I can comprehend your going on charmingly when once you had made a beginning, but what set you off in the first place? I cannot fix upon the hour or the spot or the look or the words which laid the foundation. It's too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew I had begun. My beauty you had very early withstood, and as for my manners, my behavior to you was at least bordering on uncivil, and I never spoke to you without rather wishing to give you pain. Now be sincere. Did you admire me for my impertinence? For the liveliness of your mind, I did. You may as well call it impertinence at once. It was very little less. The fact is that you were sick of civility, of deference, of officious attention. You were disgusted with the women who were always speaking and looking and thinking for your approbation alone. I roused and interested you because I was so unlike them. Had you not been really amenable, you would have hated me for it, but in spite of the pains you took to disguise yourself, your feelings were always noble and just, and in your heart you thoroughly despised the persons who so assiduously courted you. There, I have saved you the trouble of accounting for it, and really, all things considered, I begin to think it perfectly reasonable. To be sure, you knew no actual good of me, but nobody thinks about that when they fall in love. That is not the right page. Was there no good in your affectionate behavior to Jane while she was ill at Netherfield? Oh, dearest Jane, who could have done less for her? But make a virtue of it by all means. My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to exaggerate them as much as possible, and in return it belongs to me to find occasions for teasing and quarreling with you as often as may be. And I shall begin directly by asking you what made you so unwilling to come to the point at last. What made you so shy of me when you first called and after dined here? Why, especially when you called, did you look as if you did not care about me? Because you were grave and silent and gave me no encouragement. But I was embarrassed. And so was I. You might have talked to me more when you came to dinner. A man who had felt less might have. How unlucky that you should have a reasonable answer to give, and that I should be so reasonable as to admit it. But I wonder how long you would have gone on if you had been left to yourself. I wonder when you would have spoken if I had not asked you. My resolution of thanking you for your kindness to Lydia had certainly great effect. Too much, I am afraid, for what becomes of the moral if our comfort springs from a breach of promise? For I ought not have mentioned the subject. This will never do. You need not distress yourself. The moral will be perfectly fair. Lady Catherine's unjustifiable endeavors to separate us were the means of removing all my doubt. I am not indebted for my present happiness to your eager desire of expressing your gratitude. I was not in a humor to wait for any opening of yours. My aunt's intelligence had given me hope, and I was determined at once to know everything. Lady Catherine has been of infinite use, which ought to make her happy, for she loves to be of use. But tell me, what did you come down to Netherfield for? Was it merely to ride to Longbourn and be embarrassed, or had you intended any more serious consequence? My real purpose was to see you, and to judge, if I could, whether I might ever hope to make you love me. My avowed one, or what I avowed to myself, was to see whether your sister was still partial to Bingley, and if she were to make the confession to him that I have such sense made. Shall you ever have the courage to announce to Lady Catherine what is to befall her? I am more likely to want time than courage, Elizabeth. But it ought to be done, and if you will give me a sheet of paper, it shall be done directly. And if I had not a letter to write myself, I might sit by you and admire the evenness of your writing, as another young lady once did. But I have an aunt, too, who must not be longer neglected. From an unwillingness to confess how much her intimacy with Mr. Darcy had been overrated, Elizabeth had never yet answered Mrs. Gardiner's long letter, but now, having that to communicate which she knew would be most welcome, she was almost ashamed to find that her uncle and aunt had already lost 3 days of happiness, and immediately wrote as follows. I would have thanked you before, my dear aunt, as I ought to have done for your long, kind, satisfactory detail of all the particulars, but, to say the truth, I was too cross to write. You supposed more than really existed, but now suppose as much as you choose. Give loose to your fancy, indulge your imagination in every possible flight which the subject will afford, and unless you believe me actually married, you could not actually err. You must write again very soon, and praise him a great deal more than you did in your last. I thank you again and again for not going to the lakes. How could I have been so silly as to wish it? Your idea of the ponies was delightful. We will go round to the park every day. I'm the happiest creature in the world. Perhaps other people have said so before, but not one with such justice. I am happier even than Jane. She only smiles. I laugh. Mr. Darcy sends you all the love in the world that he can spare from me. You are all to come to Pemberley at Christmas. Yours. Mr. Darcy's letter to Lady Catherine was in a different style, and still different from either was what Mr. Bennet sent to Mr. Collins in reply to his last letter. Dear Sir, I must trouble you once more for congratulations. Elizabeth will soon be the wife of Mr. Darcy. Console Lady Catherine as well as you can, but if I were you, I would stand by the nephew. He has more to give. Miss Bingley's congratulations to her brother on his approaching marriage were all that was affectionate and insincere. She even wrote to Jane on the occasion to express her delight and to repeat all her former professions of regard. Jane was not deceived, but she was affected, and though feeling no reliance on her, could not help writing her a much kinder answer than she deserved. The joy which Miss Darcy expressed on receiving similar information was as sincere as her brother's in sending it. 4 sides of the papers were insufficient to contain all of her delight and all her earnest desire of being loved by her new sister. Before any answer could arrive from Mr. Collins, or any congratulations to Elizabeth from his wife, the Longbourn family heard that the Collinses were themselves to the Lucas Lodge. The reason for this sudden removal was soon evident. Lady Catherine had been rendered so exceedingly angry by the contents of her nephew's letter that Charlotte, really rejoicing in the match, was anxious to get away until the storm had blown over. At such a moment, the arrival of her friend was a sincere pleasure to Elizabeth, though in the course of their meeting she must sometimes think the pleasure dearly bought when she saw Mr. Darcy exposed to all the parading and the civility of Mr. Collins. He bore it, however, with admirable calm. He could even listen to Sir William Lucas when he commented on him carrying away the brightest jewel of the country, and he expressed his hopes of their all meeting frequently at St. James with decent composure. If he did shrug his shoulders, it wasn't till Sir William was out of sight, at least. Mrs. Phillips's vulgarity was another and perhaps a greater tax on his forbearance, and though Mrs. Phillips, as well as her sister, stood too much in awe of him to speak with the familiarity which Bingley's good humor had encouraged, but whenever she did speak, she must be vulgar. Nor was her respect for him, though it made her more quiet, all likely at all to make her more elegant. Elizabeth did all she could to shield him from the frequent notice of either, and she was ever anxious to keep him to herself and to those of the family with whom he might converse without mortification. And though the uncomfortable feelings arising from all this took from the season of courtship a lot of its pleasure, it added to the hope of the future, and Elizabeth looked forward with delight to the time when they should be removed from society that was so little pleasing to either, when they removed to all the comfort and elegance of their family party at Pemberley. And that is the end of chapter 18. And now we come to the final chapter. I'm hoping it's a wedding. I say that like I really like weddings. I like reading about weddings. I don't like being at them nearly as much, but I do like reading about them. So I hope that is what the final chapter is. Chapter 19. Happy for all her maternal feelings was the day on which Mrs. Bennet got rid of her two most deserving daughters. With what delighted pride she afterwards visited Mrs. Bingley and talked of Mrs. Darcy may only be guessed. I wish I could say, for the sake of her family, that the accomplishment of her earnest desire in the establishment of so many of her children produced so happy an effect as to make her sensible, amenable, well-informed for the rest of her life, though perhaps it was lucky for her husband, who might not have relished domestic felicity in the usual form. So she was still occasionally nervous and quite often invariably silly. Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter exceedingly. His affection for her drew him oftener from home than anything else could do. He delighted in going to Pemberley, especially when he was least expected. Mr. Bingley and Jane remained at Netherfield only a 12-month. So near a vicinity to her mother and the Meryton relations was not desirable even to Bingley's easy temper or Jane's affectionate heart. The darling wish of his sisters was then gratified. He bought an estate in a neighboring county to Derbyshire, and Jane and Elizabeth, in addition to every other source of happiness, were now within 30 miles of each other. Kitty, to her very material advantage, spent the chief of her time with her two elder sisters. In society so superior to what she had generally known, her improvement was great. She was not of so ungovernable a temper as Lydia, and removed from the influence of Lydia's example, she became, by proper attention and management, less irritable, less ignorant, and less insipid. From the farther disadvantage of Lydia's society, she was of course carefully kept, and though Mrs. Wickham frequently invited her to come and stay with her, with the promise of balls and young men, her father would never consent to her going. Mary was the only daughter who remained at home, and she was necessarily drawn from the pursuit of accomplishments by Mrs. Bennet's being quite unable to sit alone. Mary was obliged to mix more with the world, but she could still moralize over every morning visit, and as she was no longer mortified by comparisons between her sister's beauty and her own, it was suspected by her father that she submitted to the change without very much reluctance. As for Wickham and Lydia, their characters suffered no revolution from the marriage of her sisters. He bore with philosophy the conviction that Elizabeth must now become acquainted with whatever of its ingratitude and falsehood had before been unknown to her, and in spite of everything was not wholly without hope that Darcy might yet be prevailed on to make his fortune. The congratulatory letter which Elizabeth received from Lydia on her marriage explained to her that, by his wife at least, if not by himself, that hope was cherished. The letter was to this effect: My dear Lizzie, I wish you joy. If you love Mr. Darcy half as well as I do my dear Wickham, you must be very happy. It is a great comfort to have you so rich, and when you have nothing else to do, I hope you will think of us. I am sure Wickham would like a place at court very much, and I do not think we shall have quite enough money to live upon without some help. Any place would do, of about 300 or 400 a year, but, however, do not speak to Mr. Darcy about it, if you had rather not. Yours, Lydia. As it happened that Elizabeth had much rather not, she endeavored in her answer to put an end to every entreaty and expectation of the kind. Such relief, however, as was in her power to afford by the practice of what might be called economy in her own private expenses, she did frequently send them. It had always been evident to her that such an income as theirs, under the direction of two persons so extravagant in their wants and heedless of the future, would be very insufficient to their support, and whenever they changed their quarters, either Jane or Elizabeth were sure of being applied to for some assistance towards discharging their bills. Their manner of living, even when the restoration of peace dismissed them to a home, was unsettled in the extreme. They were always moving from place to place in quest of a cheap situation, and always spending more than they ought. His affection for her soon sunk into indifference. Hers lasted a little longer, and in spite of her youth and her manners, she retained all the claims to reputation which her marriage had given her. Though Darcy could never receive Wickham at Pemberley, for Elizabeth's sake, he assisted him farther in his profession. Lydia was occasionally a visitor there when her husband was gone to enjoy himself in London or Bath, and with the Bingleys, both of them frequently stayed so long that even Bingley's good humor was overcome, and he proceeded so far as to talk of giving them a hint to be gone. Miss Bingley was deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage, but as she thought it advisable to retain the right of visiting at Pemberley, she dropped all her resentment and was fonder than ever of Georgina, almost as attentive to Darcy as before, and paid off every arrear of civility to Elizabeth. Pemberley was now Georgina's home, and the attachment of the sisters was exactly what Darcy had hoped to see. They were able to love each other, even as well as they intended. Georgina had the highest opinion in the world of Elizabeth, though at first she often listened with an astonishment bordering on alarm at her lively, sportive manner of talking to her brother. Darcy, who had always inspired in her a respect which almost overcame affection, she would now see as the object of open pleasantry. Georgina's mind received knowledge which it had never before come. By Elizabeth's instructions, she began to comprehend that a woman may take liberties with her husband, which a brother will not always allow in a sister that was more than 10 years younger than himself. Lady Catherine was extremely indignant on the marriage of her nephew, and as she gave way to all the genuine frankness of her character, in her reply to the letter which announced this arrangement, she sent him language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time after all intercourse was at an end. But at length, by Elizabeth's persuasion, he was prevailed on to overlook the offense and seek a reconciliation, and after a little more resistance on the part of his aunt, her resentment gave way, either to her affection for him, or to her curiosity to see how his wife conducted herself, and she did condescend to wait on them at Pemberley, in spite of that pollution which its woods had received, not merely from the presence of such a mistress, but from the visits of her uncle and aunt from the city. With the Gardiners, they were always on the most intimate terms. Darcy, as well as Elizabeth, really loved them, and they were both ever sensible of the warmest gratitude towards the persons who, by bringing her to Derbyshire, had been the ultimate means that had united them. And that is the end of the book. I guess we don't get to see the wedding. I don't know how lavish weddings actually were in that era, if you weren't like royalty, maybe. I would be curious about that. I mean, of course, Lydia's marriage was quite hurried, but that was because Lydia was living in sin. I still wouldn't mind reading a book from Lydia's perspective. We also don't know if they had any kids. Now I'm just dying to know if, everybody popped out some children. You would assume that they would. Anyway, I enjoyed that a lot. I don't know if it would be in my top 10 favorite stories, but I really enjoyed reading it. I think because now I can see the basis for which so many tropes arose, unless Jane Austen got them from older stories. But oh my goodness, you've got the mean girls trope, you've got the enemies to lovers trope in there. I really enjoyed that. I probably couldn't do a proper analysis of it, because I just look at things, like I said, as a story. But oh my gosh, I enjoyed that story. I loved how well the characters were fleshed out, even within such a short book. Everybody's character was there, with maybe the exception of Mary. But I feel like Mary, being the quiet sister, was as fleshed out as she was probably going to be. That was very enjoyable. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I was kind of shocked at how short those last 2 chapters are, but I definitely enjoyed Jane Austen, and I definitely enjoyed Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to have to keep an eye out for more of Jane Austen as I am perusing all of my resale stores and our one actual bookstore in town. If I come across more, I'm sure we'll read them. But for now, don't forget, go to my community tab. I will have a post up with 3 books. I like to give a decent choice. We'll have 3 books up for the next possible thing that we are going to be reading together, all in the public domain. And thank you. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up on your way out if you don't mind. It does always make me smile, and I will see you in the next one.